I mentioned y'all earlier, as far as educating a child, there's so many directors that are so important to what we do. You almost cannot have a conversation on educating our students without talking to our head of finance, the man with the money, so to speak. So without further ado, turn it over to Mr. Clinton Gibbs.
Mr. Weldon. And as Mr. Weldon mentioned, I do have the distinct pleasure of really working with all of our directors. Everything you've heard so far and what you will hear following me regarding human resources, it all touches finance, some way or another. Everything costs money. So in my department, we obviously play a tight, work in a tight partnership with everyone on what they do every day. So I'm going to try to make this as brief as possible. It's kind of unfair that they put finance at the end, but then again, it is very exciting. So I'm sure that our principals, just love it when I stand up and talk. But I do want to say first and foremost, for all of you out there that are not faculty or staff with the school system, take a look over at your principal now, those people at your table. They know most of what I'm talking about here, and if they don't, they know how to get answers really fast. So as I go through this really quickly, I'm going to be talking about a few things that I'm going to hit real fast because it doesn't necessarily play a direct role in what you do as in your LSGT, but it is something that you need to know as far as our funding. So we are going to talk just for a second about just some basic funding questions, some issues, some items with how school systems are funded in the state. Then we're going to move on to the things that directly would impact you with our budgeting process and purchasing and fundraisers. Now to say that, my department, we directly, obviously purchasing, budgeting, all of that, obviously falls under finance. We also handle all of our insurance services, workers' comp, our general liability, our fleet, everything falls under our umbrella. Also work very closely with Mr. Dobart in our Human Resource Department. Better than 90% of our budget is salary and benefits. So Mr. Dobart and I work very closely together during budget time, along with each and every one of our principals. And we'll talk in just a second about our budgeting process and kind of where we are in that at this moment. So how are schools funded in Georgia? Really, there's three basic funding sources, the places that we get our money from. First and foremost is the state, and these percentages are actually about a week and a half old, so they're fairly recent figures that are statewide. So approximately 50%, 53% of the funding statewide for school systems comes from the state directly. This is in the form of QBE, which is our quality basic education. We'll talk about that in just a second. Categorical grants and targeted grants, and these are things like transportation and nursing and different grant programs that we have. Local is the second source, property tax and sales tax. Obviously, we're all aware. I think anyone who's owns a home or anything of that nature or buys something, obviously you all buy something, you're aware of what property tax is, and you're obviously then aware of what sales tax is and where we get that funding from. So and that's about 40% of our funding. The final piece is the federal, and I've listed some of our title programs out here. Dr. Slavin spoke about those, and obviously Dr. Slavin has, most of those are under his umbrella, but there are a few, SPED and a couple others that fall to different directors. But that's the smallest of our funding pot. It's about 7% of our funding comes from federal. So what is QBE? Of course, QBE is Quality-Based Education Act. It is the largest piece of our funding. The vast majority of all of our teachers, of everything we have, comes from the state in the form of QBE. And this Quality Basic Education Act was signed into law in 1985, quite a few years ago. And they have been trying pretty much since 1986 to come up with a better way to fund education, and they haven't really come up with anything. Several funding commissions, as recently as 2 years ago, have attempted to do this and have not come up with anything, probably because QBE is not a very bad formula at all. It's very complicated. If you put QBE and CCRPI in the same room, I think the planet would implode on itself because it's a very complicated formula. I come from public accounting. I dealt with the Internal Revenue Code, 10,000-page code, and when I saw this for the first time, I told Mr. Atwater, I said, "This is crazy. I mean, this is, the more I've learned and the more you see, Dr. Slavin mentioned it, and we all see it. These kids come to us in different forms, have different challenges. To fund their education, is not something that's simple. To adequately fund it, let's just say that, it's not something that you can simply do. So there's a reason that it's complicated. It was designed as the funding mechanism and has been used as that. And then, like I said, it's aiming to basically try to educate these kids based on a variety of determinants, variety of different conditions. So it consists of 19 instructional programs. Actually, there's only 18 active. If you look on the allotment sheet, there's 19, but one of those, the middle grades program, is inactive. But there's 19 programs, and when you think of a program, think of kindergarten or 1st through 3rd grade, 9 through 12. These are your programs. CTAE is a program. You have several categories of SPED. These are all of the programs that exist inside this QEE. And what it's trying to do, it uses the FTE count. Now, our FTE count, and we could talk for a week on that, is basically where we count what students are receiving what services at a given point in time. And what happens with that number is it's multiplied times the weight that the QBE formula assigns to that program, and of course you do all the math, carry the one, come out to the end, and you have a funding amount that you receive from the state. A whole lot more into it than that, but like I say, doesn't directly impact you as an LSGT. This is an area, as with everything I'm going to talk about, and like every other director has told you, I will be glad to come to your school and bore you for as long as you want me to with QBE talk. Just please let me know. I've got pages and pages and pages of stuff on this. But at this point, we'll just leave it at that. So I want to talk for a second about the budgeting process. This is a slide that I actually use in some other training, but I like to throw it in here. Sometimes I call it the steps of budgeting. This is really a local. This is how we kind of handle budgeting. And really, as you look through here, it kind of shows you where the budgets start, how they originate, and then how they progress through to final approval by the Board of Education, typically in June of every year. So we do start at the school level. Typically, and it depends on the school. Some schools, the department heads are handling it, typically in your upper grades. Sometimes in your lower grades, you have your math coach, your literacy coaches that are working with the leadership teams and the teachers in that school to just start pulling together the basic, hey, what do we need to teach students next year? They bring that to the principal. Once again, the principal in a lot of cases will have different members of their leadership team, maybe their assistant principals or someone else sitting in with them. And they go through essentially a round 2 of beating up the budget for that school. Same thing works on the department level. Obviously, some departments operate differently. For example, operations is a little bit different than that, but the same principle works there. So once the principals have gotten their school budget to the form that they are ready to move on with it, then they submit it to the central office. Now, budgets were due, it's been a week ago, November 2nd. It's been a couple of weeks ago. So all of our principals had their budgets submitted November 2nd. We have now, myself and the curriculum department, are taking those budgets, going through and looking at them and trying to kind of get our questions and so forth. Next week, when we come back after Thanksgiving, we will, in about a 3-day time period, meet with every single principal and go through their budget and look at what their needs are and what we're funding as far as their personnel, as far as their supplies. And really, at that point, you're including pretty much everyone from this level to this level. Pretty much your principals, your program curriculum directors, Mr. Weldon, myself, and Mr. Atwater are all involved in that process, and we're all meeting together. We want to sit down with each and every one and try to go through. We're looking at things like, hey, this school budgeted for this. They're a K-5, you're a K-5, you didn't. Is this something that we need to look at? Just looking at nuances and so forth, and making sure that we have all of our schools' budget somewhat consistent as much as possible. But as we move through the process, like I said, typically at some point in the early spring, I will present a tentative, if you will, maybe a preliminary would be a better word for it, budget to Mr. Atwater. Mr. Atwater and I, through a series of meetings, a lot of times just he and I, just brainstorming it and making sure we're thinking of everything we can. We'll pull all of that together, then we'll start meeting with our board, with the finance committee to begin with, several meetings with the finance committee. Sometimes those end up being joint with the curriculum or another committee, which consists of our board members. And then finally, it'll go to our full board. Usually, it will take it to our full board in April or May, get a tentative approval, or approval of the tentative budget. Let me say that in the right order, because it does change the meaning. Approval of the tentative budget in May, and then we typically get the final approval in June from the board. And there's a lot of advertisements in the paper in different places that have to take place in between all of that happening. So some budgeting notes, just directly related to the local school governance teams. And like I say, your principals are very aware of this. We work together with them. A lot of if you have questions on this, I encourage you to go to them first. 90% of the questions they're going to be able to answer when it comes to the process and so forth. And the ones they can't, they know a direct line to me. I can come out and sit in front of your group and talk about it, or I can just provide the answer to the question if it's a simple question. So you are required by board policy to approve a budget with the funds that you're receiving from the Board of Education. The board obviously allots a certain percentage of our charter funds every year to each local school governance team based on the FTE of that school. The budget, once approved, is submitted to Mr. Atwood or his designee, which in this case would be me. And then Mr. Atwood or myself, typically me, will provide a template to be used for this budget, and that's on our website. And at the very end, I have a slide that I'll show you how to get to that on our website. We do have a template that you can that you need to use for that submission. And then the budget for the following year is due the June of the previous year, June 1st of the previous year, every year. Talking about purchasing for a second, get a lot of questions on purchasing. The first one is, if I submit a purchase order today, when can I actually have the stuff sitting here? And the answer is, it depends. A good old tax accountant from years ago told me the best answer to any complicated question is it depends, and it does. Depends on a lot of things. First of all, if you remember back a few slides back when I showed you this, steps right here, imagine something similar to that as to what a purchase order typically goes through before it gets final approval. Obviously, it doesn't go all the way up to the Board of Education, but there's several steps that a purchase order has to go through to get to that final stage of approval. There's a lot of things involved. I'll tell you, a purchase order that is correctly submitted and adequately been budgeted for and so forth, typically it's not very long at all. We've actually got some new software that we're using now called eTrieve that's allowing us electronic transfer of purchase orders. It's allowed us to cut out some unnecessary steps on some, especially LSGT purchases. We're able to fast track those a little bit better and able to pinpoint if we have questions, for example. The biggest problem with purchase orders is it gets all the way to me and I look at it and I say, I don't understand this, that doesn't make sense. And I know that if I don't understand it, odds are I'm going to get questioned about it from someone up the line from me, and if I don't know the answer, obviously you see the problem. So then I have to ask the question, well, then I have to send it back. The old days of paper, when I first came on board here, we were dealing with paper. Well, you had to write it down on the sheet and stick it back in an intercampus envelope and go put it in the little mailbox, and then 2 days later they got it, and then they called you and you said, what are you talking about? And they said, well, you wrote this note. You don't remember what you did. So we're past that now. We're using electronic means to do all of that, so it's sped the process up a little bit. But the thing with the purchase order, the thing to remember specifically with our purchase orders is that first and foremost, it's got to be within the budget. It's got to be something that's in the budget. Now, that's not to say that you as an LSGT may come up and say, you know what, we didn't think about this and we didn't budget money for it, so we want to do this. You can amend your budget, and that can happen. And your principal's well versed in how that process takes place to say, hey, you're going to have a meeting, and that goes back to Mr. Pittman's rules on the open meetings and so forth. You've got to follow all of that, but your budget can be amended to get something in there that you didn't think about. So you don't have to think of everything up front. You just need to make sure you follow the process to do it. Now, another thing to remember that all purchases got to be supported by the school strategic plan and the technology plan or any other applicable plans. Meaning, especially in technology, sometimes we get technology requests from an LSGT, and we look at it, and we look at the technology plan, well, this isn't even mentioned. Where did this come from? I mean, how are we basing this decision? and that's the only question we're asking about it. If it's in that technology plan, or if it's in the strategic plan, or if it's in both, then those questions are answered before they're even asked. I'll show you in just a second, the DOE calls this financial management for local units of administration. They call it FMGALA, which is like all those letters jumbled together. I'll show you in a second how to get to that. You probably don't want to read that unless you're just struggling to get to bed one night and you can't fall asleep, because especially if you're not a finance person, it's really, but it is a resource for your LSGT to utilize if needed. One of the funnest, I guess, part of the word fundraisers, items to deal with is fundraisers. As an LSGT, you are responsible, you do have the responsibility of reviewing and approving all fundraisers for the campus that you're on the team for. What I mean by that is, if we have fundraisers and so forth that span multiple campuses, those come down to the Board of Education. So most of your booster club and athletics and all are not handled at the school level. I know Ms. Ziegler can thank me for that, not me, but others. The booster clubs and all, they all come down to us for approval. But all of the other fundraisers, your PTOs, your different club programs, if you're at the upper grade levels and so forth, all go to the local school governance team. Main things I would remind you of there, really, make sure you understand there's a few policies in particular. DKR1's a great one. That's where a lot of the information is, where you can really understand what the policies are on fundraisers. The different things that, they're only limited to having for a year. Just as far as, for example, if it's a raffle, the law requires that the sheriff give you a raffle license. Different things like that. If they filled out the fundraising request correctly, then most of the rules are going to be followed, or you're going to know that they're not followed because they checked on there that they didn't. But just make sure that you understand. Obviously, this is something that you don't want to end up having to deal with later. Approving fundraisers that didn't follow a policy, and most of the policies, I'd say all, for Mr. Atwater's purposes, all policies are in place for a great reason. And there are reasons why we have these. There's a reason why there's questions on these fundraiser requests that are worded the way they are, to make sure that we're trying to cover all of our bases and make sure that we have all of our policies and so forth taken care of. Last thing real quick, this is our website, it's our fundraiser, it's our website. And if you go to the department tag right here on our website, you'll see budget and finance. Click on that. There's a lot of resources there, a lot of financial information about the school system. If you go to the links, you can find that from Gala I was telling you about is up there. If you go to the forms, you'll see where the LSGT budget forms. You just want to look at it and see what the template looks like. You can find it right there. And once again, like I said, any questions that you may have, I'll be glad, of course, now, obviously, but also, a lot of times this works a lot better if I can come to your meeting. I've been to most of your meetings at one time or another over the last couple of years. This is something I'll be glad to come and present in more detail. If you just, are itching to be bored, just let me know. But a lot of this stuff I know when it comes to the fundraisers and purchasing and so forth are pertinent to you. And like I say, just reach out to me through your principal. Will be the easiest way to do it, and we can schedule a time that I can come and speak at your meeting. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Guest. As we start to wrap up here, one of our directors, Mr. Dobard, was involved in a hearing this morning, and so he wasn't able to break away. So Mr. Atwater is going to take over the human resources without a PowerPoint. So he's going to do it old school, so to speak. But turn it over to Mr. Atwater.
Thank you, Mr. Weld. You'll be glad I'm not using a PowerPoint. I'm the person standing between you and lunch today, lunch, dinner, whatever you were trained as a child to call it. But I do want to start Mr. Dobard's portion of this presentation by first doing what I did not do this morning. That's thanking the Tiff Regional Department for allowing us the use of this wonderful facility. So if you have anyone at Tiff Regional, please express our gratitude for them. The Tiff County Board of Education does not have a facility of this magnitude to offer these trainings, and we have a wonderful partnership with the Tiff Regional Health System. All right, so Mr. Dobar's portion was to talk about personnel. Obviously, we've heard from a lot of important people this morning, or people in charge in important departments. Let's put it like that. Well, personnel is no different. But the big thing that I want to talk to you about personnel, and I'm going to use $60 million as a round figure. Our budget on average is around $60 million per year for general fund, $100 million if you toss in the bond proceeds over the next couple of years, but $60 million on any given year the last several years. And you've heard from transportation, you've heard from curriculum, you've heard from technology, you've heard from worlds. He stepped in a little time. I'm already rolling, Mr. Bidlar. Just in time. You've heard from a world of people about a lot of things that cost a lot of money of a $60 million budget. But the one that pales in importance as it relates to how much it costs is personnel. Our $60 million budget, $54 million goes to personnel. So when we start talking about cutting back here and cutting fat there and making ends meet, when it comes down to really tough times, one of, if not the only way to make big ends meet is on the end of personnel. We have 1,100 employees working various lengths of contracts. On average, our payroll is anywhere from $230,000 to $250,000 per day. Many of you have heard teachers asking, why do we have to make up those days that we missed due to the hurricane, which the staff members, all staff members, will be making up? Well, quite frankly, you just don't throw $250,000 down the drain and say, oh, just take it and run with it. It's $250,000 per day that we don't have our staff working towards what's best for our boys and girls in Tift County. So I say that personnel is another department within our system, but it is the most expensive and most critical department that we operate within the Tift County Public School System. Mr. Dobar has a lengthy PowerPoint that goes through talking about the things that he does, and his PowerPoint discusses his recruitment and his hiring practices and compliance director, making sure that all 1,100 of these employees are in compliance with the multitudes of things that our staff members are expected to know, with FERPA and open records and open meetings and the special education director and your coaches having coaches handbooks. I will go on and on about what each specific employee is expected to know. And all of that falls on the shoulders of Mr. Dobar to make sure, Mr. Dobar and staff, to make sure that those things are met on an annual basis. 1,100 employees, all 1,100 of those employees had to be recruited. They had to be hired. They had to be trained. They had to be evaluated. They have to be rehired, or they have to be fired, or they have to be retired. So there are a lot of things that go into just a few words, but a lot of work. That is a gross simplification of what Mr. Dobar and the personnel department's duties are within the Tift County Public School System, but it is a magnanimous task. And we are struggling now, and I'm going to offer this out as a challenge as a retiring superintendent. We're struggling now through the years of the decade of the recession that we're in. People do not choose teaching as a profession. They are not choosing teaching as a profession. It is politically difficult. It is physically difficult. It is mentally difficult. The students are getting no easier to teach. So Mr. Dobar and other people in his position, in my position, and now your positions, challenges are exponentially more difficult than they were 20 years ago. When I was a principal 20 years ago, we were averaging 225 applicants per K-3 job at Annandale Park. We're lucky now if we get 10 to 15 that have 1 1/2 cents that don't have a violation of some sort, that have been fired by someone in some county in some other state. I trust you that our principals drastically need you to encourage people to go into teaching as a profession. And I said that in jest, but it's very true. The few applicants that we have now, and we are very fortunate in Tift County, and that we have good supplements and we pay Social Security. So if you retire with Tift County, you're going to retire with a higher than average salary from most school systems, and you're going to get Social Security. In every neighboring county that touches Tift, they do not take out Social Security from their checks, which means, yes, their take-home pay is larger during their career, but they also don't get that Social Security check when they get minimum age of 62. We have a lot of things to be proud of in TIF. Our personnel department is one of those. It is, again, let me say, it is the largest portion of our budget. And I want you to etch that into your head. $54 million of our school system's budget goes to a non-negotiable, virtually non-negotiable expenditure. So if and when the economy crashes again in future years, keep that in your mind, that the only way to make a big budget shortfall is with your people. And our people within our system, our teachers, our principals, paraprofessionals, bus drivers, all wore that burden over the last decade with decreased days of pay when we shortened the school years, when we shortened the work years. Personnel is very important, but it's also very exciting. Mr. Bilbart does a great job with it, with our faculty and our staff members, and our principals are on the front lines of what he has to do with each of our principals on a daily basis. And you, as it relates to the local school governance team and personnel, will play a part in setting goals with your principal, meeting with the principal of that school, discussing those goals. And in the event that you have a principal that is no longer, their service is no longer required, whether it be from one of the other words that I've already mentioned, or just flat out retirement, you will be involved as a local school governance team in the replacement of that principal. Whether you are selected as the person to sit in on the interview panel, that you sit in with a whole group of people. There are multitudes of ways, but the local school governance teams are heavily involved in the selection of the principals at the school. Now, I've rambled there a good bit. Again, $250,000 per day. It is a big, big, big portion of our budget, and it is very, very convoluted. It is as convoluted as CCRPI. I'm going to close that, Mr. Weldon. Any questions before I close? We're a little bit ahead. Raise your hand if you want me to just extend the presentation. That's what I thought. That's what I feel myself. It's been a great morning. I do want to thank all of you again as superintendent. I see the food coming in the back, so I'll keep talking just a minute or two longer. I want to take another opportunity to thank all of you as superintendent and on behalf of the Fte County Board of Education and our central office staff and principals. You will find out soon that these meetings, although quarterly, may not sound like a lot, but you will be asked to interpret and indulge and listen to and do a lot of things that you otherwise would not have been doing within our community. Take what you know, go out into our community, spread the good word, spread the challenges, and help our principals and our faculty and staff members come up with solutions to some very difficult problems that we're facing on a daily basis. You'll all have an opportunity to meet with us individually as the year progresses, as we will come to your meetings at your request. So if you have any questions that you don't ask now, please ask them in the very near future. Again, thank you for what you do and what you will do.
Thank you, Mr. Atwater. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Principals, you had a sign-in sheet at your table. If you'll please make sure all your members that were here today sign that. If you will turn that in to me, and I'll make sure you receive a copy of that as well. Great morning. I know some of you look glossed over at times. We understand. But again, appreciate all of you being here today. If you would give us about 5 minutes to finish setting up, we do have lunch for you. We'd love for you to stay and fellowship. Our directors will be here to answer any questions you may have during that time. So if you would give us about 5 minutes, and then we'll just pick up and you'll just eat at your school table area or wherever. I mean, wherever will be fine. But again, thank you all for being here today. Thank you.